The chains were forged in the village smithy, and the smith wept while he made them, and made them anyway. That is the kind of village Marrowvale was. Good people mostly. Frightened people, entirely. And fear does a thing to good people that no invader ever manages. It makes them line up, in the square where they dance at harvest, to watch a rigged lottery choose which of their neighbors will be chained to a rock. The lottery was for the dragon. Everyone knew about the dragon. It had been seen over the vale 7 times since midsummer, vast and gray-black against the clouds, and the old stories said what the old stories always say. Dragons take tribute, dragons take maidens, feed the beast or the beast feeds itself. There is a book the schoolhouse keeps, with a line from a man called Chesterton in it, about how fairy tales matter not because they tell us dragons exist, but because they tell us dragons can be beaten. The village had read the first half of every story, and none of the endings. They knew dragons existed. They had decided the beating was beyond them. Tribute, then. Magistrate Corvin organized it. Remember his name. The dragon is going to learn it too. Corvin stood on the wellhead with the lottery jar and spoke about sacrifice and the greater good, and his voice broke with emotion at all the right moments, and the jar was rigged, and the name that came out of it was Ilsa Marin. Here is what you need to know about why. 3 weeks earlier, Corvin's son had stood in the doorway of the mill with an offer of marriage, and Ilsa Marin, Miller's daughter, 27 years old, had said no. Not cruelly. She had said it the way she said everything, plainly and once. The magistrate's son was not a man who had ever heard the word before, and his father was not a man who allowed his family to hear it twice. So the jar was rigged, and the name was hers, and when it was read out, Ilsa stood in the harvest square and watched 400 people she had known her whole life look at their shoes. Her father shouted until they held him. Her brother swung at the bailiff and went down under 3 men. And Ilsa, this is the moment to watch her, because the dragon will see this same quality in her before anyone else does. Ilsa looked at Magistrate Corvin, and did not weep, and did not beg, and said in the plain voice, loud enough for the square to hear it, "Your jar has only my name in it. Every soul here knows it. I will go to the rock so that no one else has to, but you will remember, all of you, that you knew." They chained her at dusk, iron cuffs at wrist and waist, a length of chain through the great ring bolted into Sentinel Rock, up on the bare shoulder of the hill where the vale meets the sky. The smith set the last pin with his hands shaking. "Forgive me," he whispered. "You are not the one I need to forgive," Ilsa said. Then they left her. 400 people walked back down the hill in the dark, not one of them looking back, and the wind came up cold off the heights, and Ilsa Marin stood alone against the rock, chained to it, and waited for the thing in the sky to come and eat her. I am going to tell you now what the village did not know, because it changes everything you are about to see. The dragon had never asked for tribute. The dragon had never asked for anything. Its name was Varos, and it was old. Old the way rivers are old. And it had carried an emperor once, the grandfather of the emperor who sat the throne now. For 40 years, since the day the old emperor died in its saddle shadow of nothing worse than age, Varos had been riderless. It had left the capital the night of the funeral pyre and gone north into the weather, and it had stayed there, alone, for 40 years, because the bond between a dragon and its dead rider does not break cleanly. It frays, and a fraying bond aches, and an aching dragon walks the sky, the way widows walk gardens. That was the shape in the clouds. That is what the vale had been seeing all summer, not a hunter circling, but a mourner pacing. Varos had noticed the village, the way you notice a stone in your shoe, distantly, then constantly. Specifically, it had noticed the mill. Sound carries up. A girl who sang off-key to the millstones because she thought no one could hear. a girl who left the mill's midden scraps out in a neat pile every night for the Vale's foxes. In winter, every winter. Dragons see everything and care about almost none of it, but a creature keeping smaller creatures alive through the cold weather is a thing an old imperial dragon files away, because it is a thing riders did. It is a rider-shaped behavior in a world that had stopped containing his rider. Then one evening the wind brought up something new. Iron, fierce sweat, a crowd's guilt, which has a smell, I promise you it does, and a single point of warmth chained to the cold rock at the top of the hill. Varos came around in the dark sky like a ship coming around, and dropped toward Sentinel Rock to see what the small ones had done. Ilsa heard the wing beats before she saw anything. There is no sound like it. Each stroke was a held breath's length apart, unhurried, the sound of something so large it had never once needed to hurry, and the stars over the hill went out in a moving patch, shaped like the end of the world. She pressed her back against the rock, and the chains rang against the stone, taut. The dragon landed in front of her with a softness that was the most frightening thing yet. 400 tons choosing to arrive like a leaf, and folded its wings with a sound like sails being furled, and lowered its head, and looked at her. Gray-black scales, storm-colored, eyes the deep amber of lamplight through whiskey. Old, she thought, through the white roar of her own fear. It is old, and it is looking at me the way the priest looks at Corvin's ledgers, because that is exactly what Varos was doing. The dragon read the scene the way you are reading these words. A woman, chains, iron cuffs set by a shaking hand. Below, in the valley, a village with every light burning and every door barred, stinking of guilt all the way up the hill. Varos had lived among men for 200 years and had carried the law of the empire on its back. It knew what tribute was. It knew what a rigged verdict looked like. It had watched emperors hang men for less than what was bolted to this rock. The amber eyes came back to Ilsa, and Ilsa Marin, 27, out of everything else to lose, did the thing that made the next 4 days inevitable. She lifted her chin, and she spoke to it, plainly and once. "If you are what they say you are," she said, "be quick, but I will tell you first, so that someone besides me has heard it. I did nothing. The jar was rigged. The man who rigged it is asleep in the stone house by the well." Her voice did not break until the last words, and then only a little. "And if you are not what they say you are, then I am sorry they chained me in your name. It seems a poor way to greet you. Silence on the hill, wind, and the chains ticking against the rock, and an old dragon looking at a chained woman who had, with her last words in the world, apologized to it." Varos reached out one foreleg, hooked a single talon under the chain, and snapped it like a daisy stem. The cuffs came off next. This required a delicacy that no one who has never seen a dragon work would believe. The talon's point inserted into the pin slot, a fractional turn, the smith's shaking work undone in 2 motions by something that could have removed the hilltop instead. The iron dropped into the frost, and Ilsa stood unchained, rubbing her wrists, alive, in front of a monster in the dark. "Thank you," she said, because her mother had raised her, and because there was nothing in any story to tell her what else to say. The dragon did not fly away. The dragon did not eat her. The dragon turned, with the ponderous gravity of a hill deciding to move, and set itself down between Ilsa and the path to the village, the only path up, and folded its wings, and lay there, facing the village. It took Ilsa most of an hour, wrapped against the cold in the lee of the rock, to understand what she was looking at. Then it arrived all at once, and it undid something in her chest that the chains had not managed to touch. The dragon was not resting. The dragon was on watch. The head lay low along the ground, angled down the hill toward the sleeping lights of Marrow Vale, and the amber eyes were open, and every line of the great body said, older than language, "Nothing comes up this path." They had offered her to the monster, and the monster had looked at the offering, and looked at the offerers, and decided, with the whole vocabulary of its body, that it knew which side of the chains the danger lived on. Ilsa began, at last, to cry. She did it quietly, into her sleeves, the way she had cried at her mother's burying, and the dragon's near ear turned toward the sound and held there, and did not move again until she slept. She woke at first light, stiff, frost in her hair, to find the world rearranged in the night. One gray-black wing was extended above her like a roof beam. It did not touch her. It had been held there, over her, all night. A wing the size of a barn roof, cantilevered against the wind for hours, so that the frost would settle on it, and not on her. The effort of that, the sustained, deliberate ache of it, was a thing she would not fully understand until much later, when a man with amber-flecked eyes explained to her what wing muscles cost. Below them, at the bottom of the path, the village had begun to gather. 400 people, at a safe distance, staring up at Sentinel Rock, where the sacrifice was drinking melted frost from a hollow in the stone, alive, and the dragon was watching them all the way a magistrate watches a lying witness. Corvin came up the path at mid-morning with the bailiff, 6 men, and the particular walk of a man who has rehearsed his sentences. The village watched from below. He got within 40 feet. Then Varos raised its head, just its head, nothing more, and the whole delegation stopped, as if they had reached the end of their own chains. "Girl," Corvin called past the dragon, and his voice was doing the trick it did on the wellhead, warm and public and false. "Ilsa Marin, God has preserved you. The beast is tame to you. Come away from it now. Come down to your grateful neighbors. The beast is not tame," Ilsa said. She stood up on the rock so they could all see her. Chains gone, unbowed, wind pulling her hair sideways. "The beast is just. You will find it an unfamiliar quality. It wants none of your tribute. It never did. The tribute was your invention, Corvin. Yours and your jars." Her plain voice carried down the hill the way it had carried across the square. "I am not coming down. I am the only person on this hilltop who has committed no crime, and I find I prefer the company." The bailiff, who was brave and stupid, put his hand to his sword. What happened next was very fast and completely bloodless. Varos came up off the ground, all of it, at once, the way weather happens, and put one foreleg down between the delegation and the rock with an impact that knocked 3 men over, and lowered its head to the bailiff's height, and opened its mouth, and let him look all the way in. The delegation achieved the bottom of the hill in a time that is still spoken of in Marrow Vale. After that, the village tried other things. They tried a rope team at dusk on the blind side of the hill. Varos, without rising, put its tail across the blind side like a toll gate. They sent the priest, who came up trembling with a censer, and left an hour later oddly thoughtful, having got close enough to see that the dragon wore, worked into the great harness scars along its shoulders, the faded ceremonial brands of the imperial flight, and the priest was old enough to know what those meant. It was the priest who said it first, in the tavern, in the frightened hush, "That is no wild beast up there. That is a crown dragon. That is the old emperor's own, or I am a heathen, and it has appointed itself to that girl the way it was appointed to him." He looked around the room at the faces. "Which of you fools chained a woman to a rock as tribute, in front of an officer of the imperial law?" The room went very quiet, because put that way, it did sound like the kind of thing that gets a village remembered. And a rider was already on the south road with word for the capital, because a crown dragon holding a hilltop above a village for days is the kind of news that travels on its own legs. The message that reached the palace said, "The lost dragon of the emperor's grandfather is found, and it is standing guard over a chained girl on a rock in the north, and it will let no one near her." The Emperor Cassian read that message 3 times. Then he called for the imperial flight and went north himself. While the message ran south, Ilsa Marin lived 4 days on a hilltop with a dragon, and I want to slow down here, because these 4 days are the heart of everything, and because no one in the village below could see what you are about to see. She named it, for a start. Not knowing its true name, she called it Gray. It suits you, she told it. You are the color of the sky before honest rain. The dragon appeared to consider this, and to file it with the dignity of a king accepting a nickname from a child. She talked. Ilsa had spent 27 years being told she talked too plainly, and here at the end of the world was an audience that seemed to prefer it. She told the dragon about the mill, and the sluice gate her father never fixed, and her mother's burying, and the foxes she fed in winter. And at the foxes, the great head came around, and the amber eyes fixed on her with an attention so sudden and total that she laughed out loud. What? The foxes? They are small and it is cold. It costs me scraps. It costs me scraps. Remember that sentence. A creature that had carried an emperor, that had heard 40 years of court oratory, of men explaining their virtue at length and their treachery in whispers, and the truest thing said in its presence in half a century was a miller's daughter explaining mercy as if it were arithmetic. The dragon hunted at dawn, briefly, over the far ridge, and came back with deer, and set one down roasted, a single measured breath of fire, a skill plainly practiced over decades of campfires with soldiers, in front of her, on a flat stone, with the terrifying courtesy of a butler. By the second day she had stopped being afraid. By the third, she was sleeping against the warm scales of its foreleg, because the wind was cruel, and the warmth was a fact, and Ilsa Marin had never in her life pretended a fact was not a fact. And Varos, who had not been touched since a dead emperor's hands had unbuckled his own harness 40 years before, lay in the frost with a sleeping woman against his leg, and felt the frayed end of the old bond. This is the thing dragons do not tell men, that the bond seeks, reach, and catch, and begin, impossibly, after 40 years of pacing the empty sky, to hold. On the 4th morning she woke before dawn, and found the amber eyes already on her, and said, because she had been dreaming of chains, "Why me, Gray? Out of all of it, why did you stay?" The dragon could not answer in words. But it turned its head, slowly, and looked down the dark hill at the village, at the path, at the ring bolt still in the rock, and then it did a thing with its foreleg, deliberately, in front of her. It laid one talon across its own ankle, circling it, a cuff, and then it looked at her, and drew the talon away, and set the foot down between her and the path. "I know what it is to be held by something," the gesture said. "I stayed because you asked nothing. Everyone always asks." She did not understand all of it then. She wept anyway, without quite knowing why, into the storm-gray shoulder, and the dragon bore it the way it had once borne rain on campaign, patiently, as if it were weather sent personally to be endured. The imperial flight came out of the south on the 5th morning, 9 dragons in a wedge, banners of the crown streaming, and at the point of the wedge, larger than the rest, the emperor's own crimson mount. The village of Marrow Vale achieved, as one body, the most sincere collective terror of its history. 400 people who had chained a girl to a rock now stood in their square watching the actual empire descend out of the actual sky, and every one of them was doing the arithmetic the priest had already done. The wedge did not land at the village. It landed on the hill's broad shoulder, below Sentinel Rock, and the Crimson Dragon set down an emperor. Cassian was 34 years old, 3rd of his line, and he had grown up on stories of a gray-black dragon that had carried his grandfather through 2 wars and a coronation, and had vanished into the north the night of the pyre, and had been mourned in the palace the way you mourn a family member who walks out of a funeral and never comes home. 6 years he had spent sending quiet expeditions after every rumor of it. He had promised his grandfather's memory that the old dragon would not die alone in the weather like an animal. He walked up the last stretch of path on foot, alone, which his guard hated and could not prevent, and stopped 30 feet away, and looked at the scene the message had utterly failed to prepare him for. The legendary Varos, mount of Emperor Aldrich the Steady, lying across a hilltop in the shape of a fortress wall. And behind that wall, standing on the rock with her chin up and yesterday's frost in her hair, a young woman in a miller's wool dress, watching him with the expression of someone who has recently revised her opinion of authority downward and is prepared to revise it further. "Varos," the emperor said, and his voice was not an emperor's voice at all. It cracked on the second syllable. "Old one." We looked everywhere. The dragon's head came around. Amber eyes regarded the young man for a long moment, and then Varos made a sound none of the flight had ever heard, low and vast and bell-deep, the greeting tone that imperial dragons reserve for the blood of their bonded, and lowered its great head to the frost in the half-bow of the old flight etiquette. But it did not move from between the path and the girl. Cassian saw that. He was young, but he was not slow. He looked at the unmoved fortress of the body, and the ring bolt in the rock, and the broken chains still lying in the frost where they had been snapped like stems, and the cuffs with their pins turned out, and he understood the whole shape of it at once, the way his grandfather would have. "Who chained her?" the Emperor of the 9 Provinces asked, very quietly. And down in the valley, in a stone house by the well, a magistrate began, too late, to burn his papers. What happened in Marrowvale over the next 2 days was thorough. Imperial law clerks, the flight carries them for exactly this reason, took the testimony of the smith, who told everything and wept again, and of the priest, and of Ilsa's father, who had bruises from the men who held him, and of Ilsa's brother, and finally, seated on a camp chair on the hillside with the entire village required to stand and listen, of Ilsa Marin herself, who told it plainly and once, the refusal, the jar, the square, the chains, the night, the wing beats, the talon, the 4 days. "He guarded me," she finished. "Your dragon. They fed me to the monster, and the monster was the first thing in this valley that looked at the chains instead of at me. Whatever else your law decides, it should know that." Cassian was silent for a while. Then he stood and said, formally, for the record and the crowd, "The dragon Varos, first mount of the crown, has held imperial commission for 211 years. That commission has never lapsed. What he did on this rock, he did as an officer of the empire, and what was done to this woman was done under the pretense of his name." The young emperor's voice went cold and public. "The empire does not take tribute. The empire never has. Someone told you a beast in the sky wanted your daughters, and the only beast in this valley kept ledgers and rigged a jar. Corvin was taken south in irons that afternoon. The smith, at his own trembling request, was permitted to strike the cuffs himself, from the same iron, and no one in the square failed to understand the sentence underneath the sentence. His son went with him, and the bailiff. The village was fined its magistracy for a generation, and required to keep, at its own cost, a school of imperial law. And then Cassian turned to the matter he could not solve with clerks. His grandfather's dragon would not leave the girl. He tried, gently. The flight formed up. The crimson mount called the going home call. Varos rose, walked to Ilsa Marin, and lay down again. The amber eyes looked at the emperor with 200 years of patience and said, "Plain as a miller's daughter, no." "He has bonded her," the flight master said, in the stunned tone of a man reporting snow in summer. 40 years riderless. It should not be possible. But look at him. That is a bond stance, Majesty. That is a dragon at post beside a rider. It has simply chosen, without ceremony, without the trials, without anyone's permission. Yes, Cassian said slowly, watching the woman in the wool dress rest her hand, absently, familiarly, on the storm-gray foreleg the size of a wall. I am told that runs in the family. My grandfather chose in roughly the same manner. He walked up the rock and stood before Ilsa Marin, and the Emperor of the 9 provinces asked, in front of 400 people who had chained her, "Will you come south, Ilsa of Marrowvale? He will not stay without you, and I have spent 6 years finding him, and I find I cannot lose him twice." Ilsa looked at the Emperor for a long, plain moment. "The last powerful man who wanted something from me rigged a jar when I refused," she said. "What happens if I refuse you?" "Then I ride home," Cassian said, "and my grandfather's dragon lives out his years on this hill, and I visit the north far more often than my council will like." He said it simply, and it had the ring of a true coin dropped on stone. And behind her, low and bell deep, the dragon made a sound that she had learned, over 4 days, meant something close to laughter. "Then I will come," said Ilsa, "since you ask instead of taking, but the foxes by the mill get fed through winter. That comes with me. Write it in your law if you have to." They wrote it in the law. I am not inventing this. The clerks wrote it into the settlement of Marrowvale, where it remains, provision the 6th, the winter feeding of the mill foxes, in perpetuity, at crown expense. The lawyers of the capital have puzzled over that clause for years. Now you know. She went south with the flight, riding, because Varos would carry no one else, and insisted, with immovable 200-year-old courtesy, on carrying her. On the shoulders of the dragon the village had tried to pay her to. You can imagine the capital. A miller's daughter arriving on the legendary lost mount of Aldrich the Steady, bonded without trial or ceremony, walking into a court that had spent 6 years watching the young emperor send expeditions north after a legend. The court did not know what to make of her. The court said so, at length, in corridors. Ilsa fed the palace ravens every morning, plainly, in front of everyone, and said what she thought, plainly and once. And within a year the court had divided into the people who called her the rock girl behind her back, and the people, a growing faction, led with suspicious enthusiasm by the emperor, who had noticed that hers was the only council in the palace with no price hidden in it, because that, in the end, is what the Emperor Cassian could not stop noticing. He had grown up as the person everyone wanted something from. She had stood on a rock and wanted nothing, not even rescue, only justice, and the feeding of foxes. He began finding reasons to walk in the dragon grounds at the hours she was there. The reasons grew thin. The visits grew long. Varos, lying like a storm-gray hill with 2 small warm people talking against his foreleg, kept his amber eyes half closed and his opinion to himself, though the flight master swore the old dragon had begun, unaccountably, to arrange his body so that the 2 of them ended up sheltered in the same lee of the same wing whenever the wind was cold, which in the capital's dragon grounds, high over the river, was always. "Emperors are not subtle forever," he asked her on midwinter's night, on the dragon grounds, with frost in the air like the night they met, and no jar, and no crowd, and no power in it at all, asked plainly, the way she had taught the whole palace to speak. "They chained me to a rock once as a payment," Ilsa said. "You are the second thing that came out of the sky afterward, and refused to take me as one." She looked up at the old dragon, whose eyes were not in fact closed. "He broke the chains. You never once pretended they had been anything else." "Yes." Varos raised his head to the winter stars and sang, the flight call, the coronation call, unheard over that city in 40 years, and every dragon on the grounds answered, and the sound rolled over the capital like justice, and lights came on in 10,000 windows, and no one who heard it ever forgot it. They were married in the spring. The old schoolhouse book was right, as the old books usually are, Fairy tales do not exist to tell us that dragons are real. They exist to tell us that the things which frighten us can be faced. Merrowvale had known the first half and forgotten the second. It took a miller's daughter, chained to a rock by her own neighbors, to stand at the end of the world with her chin up and finish the story properly, which is this. They sent her up the hill as a payment to a monster, and the monster looked at the payment, and looked at the payers, and broke the chains, and stood guard 4 days in the frost, and carried her south to a crown. The dragon was never the thing to be feared, and the girl was never the price of anything. She was, from the first plain word she spoke into the dark, the treasure. It simply took a creature 200 years old, who had carried an empire and lost it, and paced the empty sky for 40 years, to recognize her on sight.